A single bullet, one moment of silence, and then a nation shattered. This is a true story, a story of a man who spoke for those who had no voice and was silenced for it. A story of power, conspiracy, and a justice system that looked the other way for nearly half a century. Before we begin, I want to speak directly to you. We are on a journey here at the Midnight File, and we are trying to reach 100 subscribers. If you find yourself drawn into these shadows with me, if these stories keep you awake at night the way they keep me awake, then I ask you, subscribe. Hit that like button. We would love 50 likes on this video. Your support means everything. It tells me that these forgotten files, these buried truths, deserve to be told. Now, let us descend into the darkness together. March 24th, 1980, San Salvador, El Salvador. The evening light was fading over the small chapel of the Hospital of Divine Providence. Inside, perhaps 30 people had gathered for evening mass. Nurses who had finished their shifts, patients seeking solace, ordinary Salvadorans looking for a moment of peace in a country that offered precious little of it. At the altar stood a 62-year-old man in white vestments. His name was Oscar Romero, and he was the Archbishop of San Salvador. His voice was soft but steady as he lifted the bread and wine, speaking words that Catholics have spoken for 2,000 years. Outside, a red Volkswagen rolled slowly toward the chapel entrance. Inside the vehicle sat two men. One was a driver, the other held a rifle. The chapel doors were open to let in the evening air. Through that doorway, across perhaps 40 feet of sacred space, the rifleman took aim. Archbishop Romero was mid-sentence when the shot rang out. He was speaking of sacrifice, of offering one's body and blood for the suffering of others, just as Christ had done. May this body immolated and this blood sacrificed for humans nourish us also, he said, so that we may give our body and our blood to suffering and to pain, like Christ, not for self, but to bring about justice and peace for our people. The bullet struck him directly in the heart. He collapsed behind the altar, his blood mingling with the communion wine, staining the white cloth crimson. Within minutes, one of the most beloved religious figures in Latin America was gone. The red Volkswagen sped away into the gathering dusk, and in that moment, El Salvador crossed a threshold from which it would not return for 12 terrible years. Before I tell you what happened next, before we trace the conspiracy, name the conspirators, and follow the long, tortured path toward justice that has still not reached its destination, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Leave a comment below. I want to know where in the world this story reaches. Whether you're in San Salvador itself, or São Paulo, or Stockholm, or San Francisco, tell me. Because stories like this one belong to all of us. They remind us what happens when power goes unchecked, when voices of conscience are silenced, when the machinery of the state turns against its own people. Now, let us go back. Let us understand who Oscar Romero was, and why someone wanted him gone so badly that they were willing to execute him in a house of God. Oscar Romero y Galdames was born on August 15, 1917, in a small town called Ciudad Barrios, nestled in the mountains of eastern El Salvador. His father was a telegraph operator, his mother a homemaker. The family was not wealthy, but they were respectable. Young Oscar showed an early aptitude for study, and at the age of 13 entered the seminary. Think about that for a moment. 13 years old, and already committed to a life of service to the church. While other boys his age were playing in the streets, Oscar Romero was learning Latin, studying theology, preparing himself for a vocation that would eventually lead him to the highest ecclesiastical office in his country, and to a chapel where a rifleman waited. He was ordained a priest in Rome in 1942, during the darkest days of the Second World War. He returned to El Salvador and spent the next 3 decades serving the church in various capacities, as a parish priest, as secretary to the Bishop of San Miguel, as editor of the diocesan newspaper. He earned a reputation as a careful, traditional-minded clergyman, conservative, some would say, cautious, committed to the institutional church and its hierarchy. When progressive priests in El Salvador began embracing liberation theology in the 1970s, a movement that emphasized the church's duty to stand with the poor against oppression, Romero watched from the sidelines. He was suspicious of what he saw as the politicization of faith. He believed the church's mission was spiritual, not social. He worried that priests who involved themselves in political movements were straying from their sacred calling. This is important to understand. The man who would become the voice of the voiceless, the champion of the poor, the thorn in the side of the Salvadoran military, that man did not start out as a radical. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of bishop the conservative establishment wanted, which is why, when he was appointed Archbishop of San Salvador in February 1977, the progressive clergy despaired and the oligarchy celebrated. Here was a man who would keep the church in its place. Here was a man who would not make trouble. They could not have been more wrong. To understand Romero's transformation, you must first understand El Salvador in the 1970s. Picture a country roughly the size of New Jersey, just over 8,000 square miles of volcanic mountains, coffee plantations, and coastal lowlands. Now imagine that country divided between a tiny elite who controlled virtually all the wealth and a vast majority who lived in grinding poverty. El Salvador's economy was built on coffee, and coffee was built on land. By the mid-20th century, 14 families controlled most of the country's arable land. These were the oligarchs, the 14 families, as they were known, and their wealth was beyond imagining. They lived in mansions, educated their children in Europe and the United States, and wielded political power through a series of military governments that existed primarily to protect their interests. Meanwhile, the peasants, the campesinos, worked the land they did not own, earning wages that barely sustained life. When they organized to demand better conditions, they were met with violence. When they voted for reform candidates, elections were stolen. When they protested, they were beaten, imprisoned, or simply disappeared. By the late 1970s, El Salvador was a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. Revolutionary movements were forming in the countryside. Labor unions were organizing in the cities. Students were taking to the streets, and the military, backed by wealthy landowners and increasingly by the United States government, responded with escalating brutality. Death squads began to appear, shadowy paramilitary groups with names like the White Warriors Union, the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez Anti-Communist Brigade, the Secret Anti-Communist Army. These were not rogue elements. They were organized, funded, and directed by members of the Salvadoran military and security forces, often with the knowledge and tacit approval of senior government officials. Their methods were designed to terrorize. Victims were abducted, tortured, and left in public places with signs around their necks bearing warnings to others. Be a patriot. Eliminate a priest, read one infamous flyer distributed by a death squad. Bodies appeared on roadsides, in ravines, floating in rivers. The disappeared numbered in the thousands. This was the El Salvador that Oscar Romero inherited when he became Archbishop, and this was the El Salvador that would transform him. If you're finding this story compelling, if you feel the weight of history pressing down on you the way I do when I research these files, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this one, stories of courage in the face of terror, of faith tested by fire, they matter. They remind us who we can be, even in the darkest times. Now, let me tell you about Father Rutilio Grande. Grande was a Jesuit priest who worked in the rural parish of Aguilares, about 20 miles north of San Salvador. He was everything Romero was not, or at least everything Romero had not yet become. He organized peasant communities. He established Christian-based communities where campesinos could study the Bible and connect its teachings to their daily struggles. He preached that the poor were not meant to accept their suffering as God's will, but to work collectively for a more just society. The oligarchy despised him. The military watched him. And Romero, the new archbishop, the conservative appointee, counted him as a friend. On March 12, 1977, less than a month after Romero's installation as archbishop, Father Grande was driving through the countryside with an elderly man named Manuel Solorzano and a teenage boy named Nelson Rutilio Lemus. They were on their way to celebrate evening mass in the village of El Paisnal. They never arrived. A death squad ambushed the vehicle. Grande, Solorzano, and young Lemus were shot multiple times. Their bodies were left in the road. Rutilio Grande became the first priest to fall in what would become a systematic campaign of violence against the Salvadoran Church. When word reached Romero, something shifted in him. Those who knew him described seeing a change come over him, a hardening of resolve, a clarification of purpose. He went to the site of the attack. He saw the bodies of his friend and the innocents who died with him. And he made a decision. 3 days later, Romero celebrated a single mass for the entire archdiocese, an unprecedented act of unity and defiance. Tens of thousands attended. In his homily, Romero publicly denounced the government for failing to investigate the crime. He announced that he would boycott all official state ceremonies until the perpetrators were brought to justice. They never were. But Romero had changed. The cautious conservative bishop was gone. In his place stood something new, something the powerful had not anticipated and could not control. Over the next 3 years, Oscar Romero became the conscience of El Salvador. Every Sunday, he celebrated Mass at the Metropolitan Cathedral in San Salvador. His homilies were broadcast on the radio, on YSAX, the archdiocesan station, reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners across the country. In a nation where the press was censored, where television news reported only what the government wanted reported, where the truth was dangerous, Romero's voice became the one source of reliable information. He read the names of the disappeared. He documented the atrocities. He named the death squads and their victims. He called out the military officers responsible. He demanded justice, and he did something else, something that made him not just a nuisance, but an existential threat to those in power. He connected the violence to its root causes. He spoke of the structural injustice that allowed a handful of families to live in luxury while millions starved. He quoted the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and he applied them directly to the situation in El Salvador. The Church, he said, cannot remain silent before the injustice that makes the masses poor, while the wealth remains in the hands of a few. The oligarchy was furious. They called him a communist, a subversive, a dangerous radical. They withdrew their financial support from the archdiocese. They pressured Rome to remove him. They planted stories in the press accusing him of fomenting revolution. The military was more direct. They bombed the radio station. They threatened priests who worked with Romero. They intensified their campaign against anyone associated with the Church's social mission. But Romero would not be silenced. In February 1980, just a month before his end, he wrote a letter to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. In it, he pleaded with Carter to halt U.S. military aid to El Salvador. "I am very concerned," Romero wrote, "by the news that the government of the United States is planning to further El Salvador's arms race by sending military equipment and advisors. The contribution of your government, instead of favoring greater justice and peace in El Salvador, will undoubtedly sharpen the injustice and the political repression inflicted on the organized people." Carter did not respond. The military aid continued, and within weeks Romero would be gone. Let me pause here for a moment. Let me tell you what was happening in the shadows while Romero was speaking truth from the pulpit. There was a man named Roberto d'Aubuisson. Remember that name. It will be central to everything that follows. D'Aubuisson was a former major in the Salvadoran army, a graduate of the notorious School of the Americas in Panama, and a true believer in the most extreme form of anti-communist ideology. He had been intelligence chief of the National Guard before leaving the military to pursue more flexible arrangements. By 1980, d'Aubuisson was the leader of an informal network of death squads operating with the tacit support of wealthy Salvadorans and elements within the military. He was charming, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. He appeared on television denouncing suspected leftists, often displaying documents and photographs that he claimed proved their subversion. Those he named had a tendency to turn up deceased shortly afterward. D'Aubuisson despised Romero. He saw the Archbishop as the spiritual leader of the revolutionary movement, a man whose moral authority gave legitimacy to the forces seeking to overturn the established order. He called Romero a dog, and he had a saying about dogs. "Once the dog is dead," d'Aubuisson would tell his associates, "we won't have to worry about rabies." There was a list, a death list. D'Aubuisson kept it, and he called the operation one by one, uno por uno. It was a systematic plan to eliminate priests who supported social justice. Father Rutilio Grande had been the first name crossed off. Romero was always meant to be next. March 23, 1980, the day before the end. That Sunday, Archbishop Romero delivered what would be his final public homily. The cathedral was packed, the radio broadcast reached across the nation, and Romero did something he had never done before. He spoke directly to the soldiers of El Salvador. "Brothers," he said, "you are from the same people. You are eliminating your own brothers and sisters, the campesinos. Before an order to take a life given by a man, the law of God must prevail. Thou shalt not end another's life." He paused. The cathedral was silent. No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. No one has to obey an immoral law. It is high time you recovered your consciences and obeyed your consciences rather than a sinful order. And then, in words that would echo through history, he delivered his final plea. "In the name of God, in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression." When those words reached Roberto d'Aubuisson, he made a phone call. And within hours, the conspiracy was in motion. This is where the investigation gets specific. This is where the names emerge from the shadows. According to the United Nations Truth Commission, which examined these events after the Civil War ended, the following occurred on March 24, 1980. D'Aubuisson gathered 3 members of his inner circle, Captain Alvaro Saravia, Captain Eduardo Avila, and a man known as Fernando El Negro Sagrera. They met at a location in San Salvador. Some accounts say a safe house, others suggest a military facility. The topic was simple. Oscar Romero had to be silenced, and it had to happen immediately. Captain Avila provided crucial intelligence. He knew that Romero would be celebrating Mass that evening at the small chapel of the Hospital of Divine Providence. It was a regular commitment for the Archbishop. He often said Mass for the cancer patients and staff at the hospital. The chapel was small, the congregation would be modest, and the location was relatively isolated. It was perfect. D'Aubuisson gave the order. Saravia was placed in charge of operational planning, but they needed a shooter, someone skilled with a rifle, someone cold enough to pull the trigger in a house of worship. That's when another name entered the picture, Mario Molina, the son of a former president, Colonel Arturo Armando Molina. The younger Molina suggested a man he knew from the National Guard, a sergeant named Marino Samayoa Acosta, who had previously served as a bodyguard to the president himself. Samayoa was contacted. A fee was negotiated. A rifle was procured. The pieces were in place. 6:30 in the evening, March 24, 1980. The sun was setting over San Salvador, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. Inside the chapel of the Hospital of Divine Providence, perhaps 24 people had gathered for Mass. Nurses in white uniforms, patients in wheelchairs, family members visiting loved ones. And at the altar, in white vestments, stood the Archbishop. Outside, a red Volkswagen made its way through the quiet streets toward the hospital. Inside sat Amado Antonio Garre, the driver, and Marino Samayoa Acosta, the rifleman. Samayoa was described as tall and bearded. He carried a weapon, some accounts say a .22 caliber rifle with a telescopic sight. Others describe it as a more powerful hunting rifle. A second vehicle followed at a distance. Inside were Saravia, Sagrera, and another associate named Gabriel Bibi Montenegro. They would serve as backup, providing surveillance and, if necessary, cover for the escape. The small convoy reached the hospital grounds. The Volkswagen pulled up outside the chapel entrance. Through the open doors, Samayoa could see directly to the altar, 40 feet away. Inside, Romero was approaching the most sacred moment of the Mass, the consecration of the bread and wine. He was speaking the words of institution, the words that Catholics believe transform ordinary elements into the body and blood of Christ. May this body immolated and this blood sacrificed for humans nourish us also, so that we may give our body and our blood to suffering and to pain, like Christ, not for self, but to bring about justice and peace for our people. Some witnesses later said that Romero looked up in that moment, that he saw the figure at the back of the chapel, that he knew what was about to happen, and continued anyway. Whether that's true, we may never know. What we know is this. A single shot rang out. The bullet crossed the length of the chapel in a fraction of a second. It struck Oscar Romero directly in the chest, piercing his heart. He fell backward, collapsing behind the altar. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the floor, staining his vestments, mingling with the wine that had been prepared for communion. The congregation screamed. Some threw themselves to the floor. Others rushed toward the Archbishop, trying desperately to help, to stanch the bleeding, to do something, anything. It was too late. Within minutes, Oscar Arnulfo Romero was gone. Outside, the red Volkswagen sped away. The backup vehicle, having heard the shot, followed. The entire operation had taken less than 2 minutes. If you're still with me, if this story has gripped you the way it grips me every time I revisit these files, then I want to thank you, and I want to ask you to share this video. Send it to a friend, post it on social media, because the more people who know this story, the harder it becomes to forget. The harder it becomes for those responsible to escape the judgment of history. Now let me tell you what happened next. News of Romero's passing spread across El Salvador like wildfire. Within hours, the country was in shock. The poor, who had loved him as a father and protector, wept openly in the streets. The oligarchy, who had despised him, celebrated privately. The military, who had feared him, breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the violence was not over. 6 days later, on March 30th, 1980, the funeral was held at the Metropolitan Cathedral in San Salvador. Estimates of the crowd varied, but most accounts suggest that between 50,000 and 100,000 people gathered, the largest assemblage of Salvadorans in the nation's history. They came from every corner of the country, peasants who had walked for days, workers who had taken off from their jobs, students, priests, nuns, union organizers. They filled the plaza in front of the cathedral and spilled into the surrounding streets for blocks in every direction. Inside the cathedral, the funeral mass proceeded. Church dignitaries from around the world had come to pay their respects. The homily spoke of Romero's courage, his faith, his commitment to the poor. And then, from somewhere outside, an explosion. Smoke bombs detonated in the crowd. Panic erupted. And then came the gunfire. Snipers opened fire from surrounding buildings, from rooftops, from windows, from positions near the National Palace. Some wore uniforms. Others were in civilian clothes. The crowd had nowhere to go. People screamed, stampeded, trampled each other in their desperate attempts to escape. Official government sources later reported 31 casualties. Independent journalists documented between 30 and 50. More than 200 people were injured. Many of those who fell did not succumb to bullets, but to the crush of bodies as tens of thousands of panicked mourners tried to flee through narrow streets. Inside the cathedral, the clergy made a terrible decision. They would bury Romero immediately before the violence could claim more lives. As gunfire still echoed outside, they carried his coffin down into the crypt beneath the sanctuary and laid him to rest. Even in the act of honoring him, Romero's followers were not safe. In the weeks that followed, 2 things happened that would define the trajectory of justice, or the lack thereof, for decades to come. First, just over a month after the assassination, Salvadoran security forces raided a farmhouse where D'Aubuisson and several of his associates were meeting. Among those arrested were Captain Saravia and several others connected to the Death Squad network. More importantly, the raid produced a treasure trove of documentary evidence. Saravia's personal agenda, his day planner, contained detailed notes about what he called Operation Pineapple. The notes referenced the weapon, the personnel involved, the logistics of the attack. They were, in essence, a written confession. Additionally, investigators found documents linking D'Aubuisson to Death Squad activities, to planning sessions for various political assassinations, and to a broader network of wealthy backers who financed the violence. The evidence was overwhelming. The perpetrators were in custody. Justice, it seemed, was within reach. And then, 7 days later, Minister of Defense José Guillermo Garcia ordered D'Aubuisson and the others released. No charges were filed. No trial was held. The evidence vanished into military custody, where much of it would remain hidden for years. The message was unmistakable. In El Salvador, There were people who could not be touched. The second thing that happened was the beginning of the Civil War. In the months following Romero's end, El Salvador descended into full-scale conflict. Revolutionary groups that had been organizing in the mountains launched coordinated attacks against government forces. The military responded with overwhelming force, often directed not at armed combatants, but at civilian populations suspected of sympathizing with the left. The massacres began. El Mozote, El Calabozo, the Sumpul River, names that would become synonymous with atrocity. Over the next 12 years, an estimated 75,000 Salvadorans would lose their lives. More than 1 million, roughly 1/5 of the entire population, would be displaced. According to the United Nations Truth Commission, which investigated the violence after the war ended, more than 85% of the atrocities were committed by government forces and associated death squads. And throughout it all, the United States remained El Salvador's most important ally. Fearing communist expansion in what it considered its backyard, the Reagan administration poured money and weapons into the conflict. At its peak, U.S. aid to El Salvador reached nearly $2 million per day. American military advisors trained Salvadoran soldiers. American intelligence shared information with Salvadoran security forces. American diplomats publicly defended the Salvadoran government, even as the bodies piled up. When asked about Romero's assassination, U.S. Ambassador Robert White, one of the few American officials who publicly criticized the regime, testified before Congress that there was sufficient evidence to convict D'Aubuisson of planning the crime. But D'Aubuisson was too useful an ally to prosecute. He went on to found the Arena Party in 1981, became president of the Constituent Assembly in 1982, and nearly won the presidency in 1984. He lived as a free man until his passing from cancer in 1992. The Civil War ended in 1992 with the signing of the Chapultepec Peace Accords. As part of the peace process, a truth commission was established to investigate the worst abuses committed during the conflict. The commission's report, released in March 1993, was damning. It named names. It documented chains of command. It described, in meticulous detail, how death squads had operated with the knowledge and support of the Salvadoran military establishment. Regarding the Romero assassination, the commission was unequivocal. Roberto D'Aubuisson had ordered the crime. Alvaro Saravia had organized it. The shooting was carried out by a professional hired for the purpose. The conspiracy was documented, the evidence was clear, and justice demanded accountability. 5 days later, the Salvadoran Legislative Assembly passed the General Amnesty Law for the consolidation of peace. The law was absolute. It covered all human rights violations committed during the Civil War by all parties. It was retroactive, prospective, and comprehensive. Its effect was immediate. All criminal charges against Saravia and anyone else connected to war crimes were dismissed. The architects of the violence walked free. The victims and their families were left with nothing. For 23 years, that amnesty law stood as an impenetrable wall. It didn't matter that everyone knew who had ordered Romero's execution. It didn't matter that witnesses had come forward, that documents had been found, that confessions had been made. The law said there would be no justice, and so there was none. But history has a way of catching up with those who believe they have escaped it. Let me tell you about what happened in a courtroom in California. In 2003, a human rights organization called the Center for Justice and Accountability filed a civil lawsuit in U.S. federal court. The plaintiff was a relative of Archbishop Romero. The defendant was Alvaro Rafael Saravia, who was then living in Modesto, California. Under U.S. law, specifically the Alien Tort Statute and the Torture Victim Protection Act, foreign nationals can be sued in American courts for human rights abuses committed abroad. It's not criminal prosecution. The defendant doesn't face prison time. But it allows victims to seek financial damages and, perhaps more importantly, to establish a legal record of culpability. Saravia was served with the lawsuit at his home. He never responded. He never appeared in court. He simply vanished. The court found him in default and proceeded to a damages hearing. And it was there, in August 2004, that the full story finally emerged in an official legal proceeding. The key witness was Amado Antonio Garay, the driver of the red Volkswagen. Garay had fled El Salvador years earlier and was living in the United States under a new identity. He came forward and testified under oath about what he had seen and done. He described picking up the rifleman at the Camino Real Hotel. He described driving to the hospital chapel. He described waiting outside while the shot was fired. He described the escape route, the safe houses, the payments that were made. His testimony was corroborated by documentary evidence, including Saravia's own agenda, which had been seized in the 1980 raid and eventually made its way to investigators. On September 3, 2004, Judge Oliver Wanger issued his ruling. Alvaro Rafael Saravia was found liable for his role in the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero. He was ordered to pay $10 million in damages. It was the first time any court anywhere in the world had held anyone legally responsible for the crime. Saravia, of course, never paid. He remains a fugitive to this day, believed to be hiding somewhere in Latin America. He is on the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's most wanted list. But the judgment stands. The legal record exists. And for the first time, there was an official finding of culpability. If this story is moving you, if you're feeling the weight of decades of injustice pressing down on your chest, then I want you to do something for me. Hit that like button, leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling, because these stories only matter if they're heard. They only change things if people engage with them. Now let me tell you about the confession. In 2010, 30 years after the assassination, the Salvadoran newspaper El Faro published an extraordinary document, a 10,000-word interview with Alvaro Saravia, conducted while he was in hiding. It was the first time any member of the conspiracy had spoken publicly about what happened, and while Saravia's account was self-serving in many respects, he insisted he hadn't personally pulled the trigger, that he was just following orders, that the real responsibility lay with D'Aubuisson. It confirmed, in devastating detail, the mechanics of the plot. Saravia described the meeting where the decision was made. He named the participants. He explained how the shooter was recruited, how the weapon was obtained, how the operation was planned. He confirmed that D'Aubuisson was the mastermind, that the order came directly from him, that he was the one who decided Romero had to go. "Everything around me was rotten," Saravia said in the interview. "Everybody was after money no matter what." He spoke of the guilt that had haunted him for 3 decades. He spoke of the nightmares, the paranoia, the constant fear of being found. He spoke of living in poverty, dependent on the charity of friends, a far cry from the powerful circles he had once moved in. "And look at me now," he said. "I've learned to live with what I have. I've lived with people who are really suffering." It was, in its way, a kind of confession, but it was made from hiding, safe from prosecution, beyond the reach of any court. Saravia had unburdened his conscience without facing any consequences. The amnesty law that protected Saravia, and so many others, finally fell on July 14, 2016. The Salvadoran Supreme Constitutional Court ruled that the 1993 amnesty was unconstitutional. The decision was historic. For the first time since the end of the Civil War, it became legally possible to prosecute those responsible for wartime atrocities. In May 2017, Judge Ricardo Chicas formally reopened the Romero assassination case. He ordered prosecutors to pursue criminal charges against Saravia, the principal surviving suspect. Hope flickered. Perhaps, after nearly 4 decades, justice would finally be served. And then, nothing. As of 2024, the case remains dormant. According to attorneys representing human rights organizations, there have been no judicial movements, no hearings, no indictments, no progress whatsoever. The file sits in the 4th Investigative Court gathering dust. Saravia remains a fugitive. The other conspirators are gone, D'Aubuisson to cancer in 1992, others to old age or obscurity. The shooter, Marino Samayoa Acosta, was only publicly identified in 2010 and has never faced prosecution. Nearly 45 years after a bullet silenced one of the most powerful moral voices of his generation, not a single person has spent a day in prison for the crime. On October 14, 2018, a ceremony took place in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. Before a crowd of tens of thousands, Pope Francis declared Oscar Romero a saint of the Catholic Church. It was the culmination of a process that had been delayed for decades, first by conservative elements within the Church, who were uncomfortable with Romero's political legacy, then by the slow grinding of Vatican bureaucracy. But finally, 38 years after his passing, the Church formally recognized what millions of Salvadorans had always known, that Romero was a martyr, a witness to faith, a man who gave his life for the truth. Thousands of Salvadorans made the pilgrimage to Rome for the ceremony. Among them were survivors of the Civil War, relatives of the disappeared, priests and nuns who had served alongside Romero. Also present was Maria Luisa de Martinez, the sister of Roberto d'Aubuisson. She attended as a member of the Archbishop Romero Foundation, an organization she helped found. For human rights activists, her presence was a bitter irony, the sister of the man who ordered Romero's execution, walking freely among those who had come to honor his memory. What are we to make of all this? The Romero case is not simply a historical curiosity, it is a case study in how impunity operates, how the powerful protect their own, how systems of justice can be corrupted, how the truth can be known without ever leading to accountability. Consider what we know. The assassination was meticulously planned by identifiable actors. Their names are in the public record. Their roles have been documented by a UN Truth Commission, confirmed by witness testimony, corroborated by documentary evidence, and admitted in a published confession. A US federal court found one of the conspirators legally liable. The amnesty law that protected the perpetrators was declared unconstitutional. The case was formally reopened. And still, no one has been punished. How is this possible? Part of the answer lies in the amnesty law itself. For 23 years, it made prosecution impossible. During that time, evidence was lost or destroyed. Witnesses passed away or disappeared. Memories faded. The machinery of justice rusted. Part of the answer lies in the political continuity between the war years and the peace. D'Aubuisson's Arena Party governed El Salvador from 1989 to 2009. The party of the conspirators held state power for 2 decades after the peace accords. They had no interest in prosecuting their founder. Part of the answer lies in institutional weakness. El Salvador's judicial system lacks the resources, the independence, and perhaps the political will to pursue cases against powerful figures connected to the old military establishment. Judges who push too hard find their careers stalled. Prosecutors who ask uncomfortable questions find themselves reassigned. And part of the answer lies in the complicity of the United States. American officials knew about the death squads. They knew about d'Aubuisson. They had intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, eyewitness accounts. And they chose to look the other way because Cold War priorities trumped human rights concerns. The Reagan administration certified to Congress year after year that El Salvador was making progress on human rights, a legal requirement for continued military aid. Those certifications were lies. Everyone knew they were lies, but the aid kept flowing and the bodies kept piling up. I want to read you something. It's from Romero's final homily, delivered the day before he was taken from this world. Those who surrender to the service of the poor through love of Christ will live like the grain of wheat that dies. It only apparently dies. If it were not to die, it would remain a solitary grain. The harvest comes because of the grain that dies. We know that every effort to improve society, above all when society is so full of injustice and sin, is an effort that God blesses, that God wants, that God demands of us. Romero knew what was coming. He had received countless threats. His friends begged him to be more careful, to travel with bodyguards, to vary his schedule. He refused. A shepherd does not seek security while the flock is in danger, he said. He understood that his voice had become powerful, precisely because he was willing to risk everything. If he retreated into safety, if he moderated his message, if he made peace with the powerful, he would lose the moral authority that made his words matter. And so he continued. He continued to name names. He continued to read the lists of the disappeared. He continued to call out the generals and the oligarchs and the death squad leaders. He continued until a bullet stopped him. There's a concept in liberation theology called the preferential option for the poor. It doesn't mean that God loves poor people more than wealthy ones. It means that a just society must be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members. It means that those with power have a special obligation to stand with those without it. Romero embodied that principle. He could have lived a comfortable life as a conservative bishop, beloved by the establishment, secure in his position. Instead, he chose to stand with the campesinos, the workers, the students, the families of the disappeared. That choice cost him everything, but it also gave him something that his persecutors could never take away, a legacy that has only grown more powerful with time. Today, Romero is venerated not just by Catholics, but by people of all faiths, and none who recognize in him something essential about human dignity. His image appears on murals throughout Latin America. His words are quoted by activists around the world. His feast day, March 24th, is observed as a day of remembrance and resistance. The men who ordered his execution thought they were silencing a troublesome priest. Instead, they created a martyr whose voice speaks louder now than it ever did in life. I want to take you back to that chapel one more time. It's evening. The light is fading. Inside, the congregation has gathered, nurses, patients, ordinary people seeking a moment of peace. At the altar stands a 62-year-old man in white vestments. His hair is grey, his glasses are thick, his voice is gentle but firm. He lifts the bread. He speaks the words of consecration. Outside, a red Volkswagen rolls slowly toward the entrance. Inside, a rifleman takes aim. And in that suspended moment, that fraction of a second between the world as it was and the world as it would become, Oscar Romero speaks his final complete sentence. May this body immolated and this blood sacrificed for humans nourish us also, so that we may give our body and our blood to suffering and to pain, like Christ, not for self, but to bring about justice and peace for our people. He was speaking of Christ. He was speaking of the Eucharist. But he was also, whether he knew it or not, speaking of himself. His body would be immolated. His blood would be sacrificed, and his offering would nourish generations of Salvadorans who refused to accept injustice as the natural order of things. The bullet came, he fell, and in falling, he rose to something greater than he had ever been in life. Let me tell you about the investigation that almost was. After the Truth Commission report in 1993, after the amnesty law in 1993, after the decades of silence, something began to shift in the 2000s. Journalists started digging. Human rights organizations started collecting testimonies. Former death squad members, aging and perhaps haunted by what they had done, started talking. The picture that emerged was more detailed, more damning, and more complex than what had been previously known. We learned about the financial networks that supported the death squads, the wealthy businessmen who contributed funds, the military officers who provided weapons and intelligence, the politicians who looked the other way. We learned about the meetings where targets were selected, sometimes based on intelligence reports, sometimes based on personal grudges, sometimes based on nothing more than rumor and suspicion. We learned about Operation Pineapple in granular detail, who was present at the planning meeting, who suggested the shooter, who provided the vehicle, who paid the fee. And we learned something else, that Romero's assassination was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate what D'Aubuisson called the dogs, priests who supported social justice. Father Rutilio Grande had been the first. But there were others. Father Alfonso Navarro, shot in 1977. Father Ernesto Barrera, shot in 1978. Father Rafael Palacios, shot in 1979. Father Illyrio Napoleon Macias, shot in 1979. And then in December 1980, just 9 months after Romero's passing, the most shocking attack of all, 4 American churchwomen, Mary Knoll's sisters, Etta Ford, and Maura Clark, Ursuline's sister Dorothy Kazel, and lay missionary John Donovan, were abducted, assaulted, and executed by members of the Salvadoran National Guard. The pattern was clear. The church had become a target, and Romero's execution was the centerpiece of a broader campaign of terror. Let me tell you about a man named Amado Antonio Garay. Garay was the driver of the red Volkswagen on the day of the assassination. He was not a hardened criminal or a committed ideologue. He was, by his own account, a young man who had gotten involved with the wrong people and found himself in over his head. After the assassination, Garay fled El Salvador. He made his way to the United States, where he assumed a new identity and tried to disappear into anonymity. For years he lived in fear of being found by his former associates, fear of being prosecuted, fear of the memories that haunted him. In 2003, when the Center for Justice and Accountability tracked him down for the civil lawsuit against Saravia, Garay faced a choice. He could remain silent and hope to stay hidden, or he could come forward and finally tell the truth. He chose to testify. Under oath, Garay described in detail what had happened on March 24, 1980. He described the vehicle. He described the route. He described the shooter, tall, bearded, carrying a rifle. He described waiting outside the chapel as the shot rang out. He described the escape. His testimony was crucial to the court's finding against Saravia. It provided the first-hand account that corroborated the documentary evidence. But Garay also said something else, something that revealed the human dimension of this tragedy. He said he had carried the guilt for more than 2 decades. He said he had nightmares about what he had done. He said he had sought redemption but was not sure he would ever find it. "I was young," he said. "I didn't understand what I was involved in. By the time I understood, it was too late." I don't tell you this to excuse Garay or to minimize his culpability. He was part of a conspiracy that took a man's life. He bears responsibility for that. But I tell you this because it illustrates something important about how evil operates. It doesn't require monsters. It requires ordinary people who go along, who follow orders, who tell themselves they have no choice. The banality of evil, Hannah Arendt called it. And it is perhaps more terrifying than any cartoon villain could ever be. The civil war in El Salvador ended in 1992, but its wounds have never fully healed. More than 75,000 people lost their lives. More than 1 million were displaced. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Families were torn apart, some never to be reunited. And for all the suffering, what was achieved? The peace accords brought some reforms. The military was reduced in size and stripped of its internal security functions. A new civilian police force was created. Elections were held, and they were, for the most part, free and fair. But the underlying inequalities that had sparked the conflict remained largely unchanged. The same families still controlled most of the wealth. The same desperate poverty still afflicted the majority. The same institutional weakness still plagued the government. And the perpetrators of the worst atrocities, the generals, the death squad leaders, the wealthy backers, were never held accountable. The amnesty law ensured that. For 23 years it stood as an impenetrable barrier. And even after it was overturned in 2016, the momentum for justice had largely dissipated. People had moved on. Witnesses had passed away. Evidence had been lost. The political will to prosecute had evaporated, and so the files remain closed. The questions remain unanswered. The ghosts remain unquiet. If you've stayed with me this long, if you've followed this story from the chapel to the courtroom, from the amnesty law to the Vatican, then I want to thank you. These stories are not easy to tell, they are not easy to hear. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about justice, about our own complicity in systems of violence. But they matter. They matter because the people who lived them, who suffered, who struggled, who gave their lives, deserve to be remembered. They matter because the injustices of the past continue to shape the present. They matter because, as long as we remember, there is hope that things can change. So if this story has moved you, if it has made you think, if it has made you feel something, then please share it. Send it to a friend, post it on social media, leave a comment telling me what you're thinking, and subscribe. Hit that button. Join us here at the Midnight File, because there are more stories to tell, more files to open, more truths to uncover. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we close this file. In the years since his passing, Oscar Romero has been honored in countless ways. Streets and schools bear his name. Statues stand in his likeness. His image adorns churches and community centers throughout Latin America. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is the simplest one. Every year, on March 24th, Salvadorans gather at the chapel where he fell. They light candles, they say prayers, they remember. Some of them are old enough to have been there in 1980, to have heard the shot, to have seen the blood spreading across the altar. Others are young, born long after the war ended, knowing Romero only through stories and images, but they come. Year after year, they come. And in that gathering, in that act of remembrance, something powerful happens. The past reaches out and touches the present. The voices of the silenced speak again. The demand for justice, though long denied, refuses to die. Romero understood this. He understood that the powerful could eliminate a man, but they could not eliminate a message. He understood that truth, once spoken, takes on a life of its own. "If I am taken from this world," he said shortly before his passing, "I will rise again in the Salvadoran people." He has. We come now to the end of this file, but I want to leave you with a question. What does it mean for a crime to go unpunished? Not just this crime, but any crime of this magnitude, a crime that is documented, witnessed, confessed to, and yet never officially punished. Some would say it means that justice has failed, that the systems we have created to hold the powerful accountable are fundamentally broken. That might make right in the end, and the strong will always escape the consequences of their actions. There is truth in that. The Romero case is, by any objective measure, a failure of justice. The men who ordered his execution, who planned it, who carried it out, they were never punished by any Salvadoran court. D'Aubuisson became a political leader. Saravia disappeared into hiding. The shooter was never tried. But I want to suggest another way of looking at it. Justice is not only what happens in courtrooms, it is also what happens in hearts and minds. It is the slow accumulation of truth. It is the refusal to forget. It is the insistence, against all evidence, that what was done was wrong and must never be done again. By that measure, Romero has received a kind of justice, incomplete, imperfect, but real. His persecutors are remembered not as victors but as villains. D'Aubuisson's name is synonymous with death squads and political violence. The Arena Party he founded has spent decades trying to distance itself from his legacy. Meanwhile, Romero's name is synonymous with courage, with faith, with the defense of human dignity. He is a saint of the Catholic Church. He is an inspiration to activists around the world. He is proof that one voice speaking truth can echo through history. Is that enough? No, it is not enough. The families of the victims deserve more. The Salvadoran people deserve more. The demands of justice require that crimes be punished, that perpetrators face consequences, that the law apply equally to the powerful and the powerless. But it is something. It is more than nothing. And in a world where so many crimes vanish into silence, where so many victims are forgotten, where so many truths are buried, it is perhaps a kind of miracle. The chapel of the Hospital of Divine Providence still stands. It has been preserved as a memorial, a place of pilgrimage for those who wish to honor Romero's memory. If you ever find yourself in San Salvador, you can visit. You can stand where he stood. You can see the altar where he fell. You can light a candle and say a prayer. And in that quiet space, in that small chapel where evil once triumphed and grace endured, you might feel something stir. A whisper from the past, a challenge from the present, a question that will not let you rest. What would you be willing to sacrifice for truth? This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. If stories like this stay with you, if they keep you up at night turning questions over in your mind, then subscribe. Because the next file might be darker still. Like this video if it moved you. Share it if you think others need to hear it. And leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what stories you want me to investigate next. The archive is vast. The mysteries are endless. And I'll be here, in the shadows, waiting to guide you through. Until next time, sleep well, if you can. Oscar Arnulfo Romero, Igaldames, August 15th, 1917, March 24th, 1980. If I am taken from this world, I will rise again in the Salvadoran people. He did.